Hi again, students. Right now, I'm going to teach you how to cite textual evidence and make inferences about a text. So your objective or your I can statement here is, I can cite textual evidence and make inferences about a text. So what does that mean? What does it mean to cite textual evidence? Well, that's what we're going to learn how to do right now. So, when you cite textual evidence, that just means you pull out a piece of evidence from the text. So, the text is just anything that you read. It could be a book, it could be a newspaper article, it could be an actual text message. Anything that you read that's written down is considered to be a text. So, basically, if you pull out evidence from a text, you're just telling me something that it said in that writing. So you could use a quotation, or you could just tell me in your own words what it said. Let's look at an example. Here is a quote from it's actually a nonfiction article about a big fire that happened in San Francisco a really long time ago. It says, a shed attached to the barn was already engulfed by flames. It contained 2 tons of coal for the winter and a large supply of kindling wood. Fire ran along the dry grass and leaves and took hold of a neighbor's fence. The heat from the burning barn, shed, and fence was so hot that the O'Leary's house, 40 feet away, began to smolder. Neighbors rushed from their homes, many carrying buckets or pots of water. The sound of music and merrymaking stopped abruptly, replaced by the shout of fire. It would be a warning cry heard thousands of times during the next 31 hours. Okay, so I'm going to cite a piece of evidence from this text to tell you something that I learned from it. So I said, I can tell from this paragraph that there was a big fire. And you notice that I made this red here. The barn was already engulfed by flames. So this is a piece of quote or a piece of textual evidence. It's a quotation or a piece of textual evidence that I would use to support my statement. I said the barn was already engulfed by flames. And see, I put this in quotation marks. That's what these little markings are. They're called quotation marks. That's to show that this isn't my own writing. This is something that I took, I copied it and I pasted it from what I read, and I'm using it as my evidence. But I don't want to put it as my own words because it's not my own words. That would be stealing. Okay. So, let's keep looking at this. I don't have to use a quotation. So, I did use a quotation on that example, but I don't have to. Instead of using a quote, if I want to, I could just paraphrase what it says in the text. So a paraphrase is just restating in your own words what it said. So instead of writing that quote saying the barn was already engulfed by flames, I could simply just say, in the story, it said that a barn was covered in fire, or the barn was covered in flames. That's how you paraphrase something. You just kind of like restate it or summarize it in your own words, and you don't have to put quotes around that. So either one of those is a textual evidence, using the actual quote like this, or just paraphrasing it. Okay, so what I want you to do is take a look at this picture. What is the evidence we see in this picture? Take a minute and think about that. What evidence do we have in this picture? What do you see here? What's going on? Here are some possible answers. There's a boy on the ground. Yes, we see a boy on the ground. Okay, good. We could say his bike is next to him. That's evidence, right? We do see his bike there. If I was a detective looking at this photo, trying to figure out what happened, and I could use this as evidence, what would I see? What would I notice about it? We could see that also that the boy is crying. That would be a good answer. The boy seems to be crying. He's sitting on the ground. He also appears to be bleeding. On his arm there, he seems to be bleeding, right? So all of that is evidence. Okay, so what does it matter? It seems kind of obvious to us, right? Let's click all the words that are evidence that the little boy fell off of his bike. So here's a paragraph. It says Billy sat on the ground crying. His arm was skinned and bloody. His new bike was likely broken forever. This was the worst day he could remember. He yelled and cried, but he didn't think anyone could hear him. There was no one around. So all of these words show us that he probably fell off his bike, right? Well, duh, that's what we see in the picture. It looks very obvious that he fell off of his bike, doesn't it? So using that evidence, using what we see in the picture, his bike is on the ground, he has a helmet on, his elbow is skinned and bloody, he's crying. We use that evidence from what we see to make an inference. That's the second word that we have to define here. We talked about textual evidence. Now we're going to talk about an inference. You already know how to make inferences. I don't have to teach you how to make inferences. You do this every day, just like you did when you looked at the little boy in the picture. I know you knew right away, well, obviously, he fell off of his bike. That's the clear and obvious inference that we would come to when we look at this. An inference is just an educated guess based on the evidence in front of us. It's easy to do when we look at a picture or a photo, or we see something when we're just walking by. If you were walking down the street and you saw a bunch of ambulances and fire trucks and 2 cars that were all smashed up, you would make the inference that there was a car accident, right? That's an obvious one. So some possible inferences here about this little boy in the picture was the boy was riding his bike when he fell. We could also say a boy was alone and riding his bike and he fell and there's no one around to help him. So we're taking that a little bit further because we don't see anybody else in the picture around, right? Or we could simply say a boy fell off of his bike and he hurt his arm. That's taking it a little further too because we can see his arm is red in the picture. Now, it's possible that we're wrong. Maybe this scrape on his arm was old and he didn't just hurt it. Or maybe he was just walking his bike when he tripped. So that's why it's an inference and it's not a fact, because we're guessing. We're making a very educated guess based on what we can see, but it isn't a fact. We don't know for sure. We could be wrong, right? But it seems pretty obvious that he probably fell off his bike, and we know that because of our own personal experiences and our background knowledge. Most of us have ridden a bike before, or at least seen someone riding a bike. And we know that if you have a bike laying on a floor and you're wearing a helmet and you have a big cut on your arm and you're crying, all of that adds up to you probably fell off your bike and you probably got hurt. So that's what we're doing when we're making inferences when we're reading. It's similar, only we don't have pictures to look at. So let's go back to what we read with the barn engulfed by flames and make some more inferences. It says, a shed attached to the barn was already engulfed by flames. It contained 2 tons of coal for the winter and a large supply of kindling wood. Fire ran along the dry grass and leaves and took hold of a neighbor's fence. The heat from the burning barn, shed, and fence was so hot that the O'Leary's house 40 feet away began to smolder. Neighbors rushed from their homes, many carrying buckets or pots of water. The sound of music and merrymaking stopped abruptly, replaced by the shout of fire. It would be a warning cry heard thousands of times during the next 31 hours. Okay, we can make tons of inferences from this passage, right? We know for sure that there was a fire. There's no doubt about that. It says that the barn was engulfed by flames. We can infer or guess that it lasted for 31 hours because it says here, I'm using textual evidence to prove my point. I infer that the fire lasted for 31 hours, and I am inferring this because right here it says the next 31 hours, right? what else could we infer? We could infer that there was a party going on because it said the sound of music and merrymaking stopped abruptly. We could infer that the O'Learys lived somewhere nearby because their name is mentioned here. So there's lots of different inferences we could make just based on this text. Okay, so here I want you on your page to mark the words that support the inference that there was a fire happening in this text and that the fire lasted for 31 hours. So if something is engulfed by flames, we can pretty safely say it's on fire, right? We have the word fire here. We have the word heat, burning barn. All this indicates that there's a fire. So hot, right? And what about where they say fire? That clearly tells us that there's a fire. And then lastly, how do we know it lasted for 31 hours? Well, it says that they were crying fire for the next 31 hours. So that probably means they were yelling fire for 31 hours, and that's how long there was a fire for. Okay, now, how do you actually write a sentence where you use textual evidence to support your inference? So here's an example. When making an inference and citing evidence, you will use sentences such as these. In the story, it says, and then this is where you put your quote, fire. It would be a warning cry heard thousands of times during the next 31 hours, which shows that there was a fire that burned for 31 hours. So you put your quote in there or your paraphrase, and you explain what does that quote show you? What can you infer? What can you guess based on that quote that you showed? Okay, so I want you to practice it by filling in the blanks. And this is about the young boy in the picture. So it says, I can tell that the young boy in the picture, blank off of his blank. The blank that shows this is the fact that he is wearing a helmet, has a bike next to him, and he is sitting on the blank. I can blank that he was hurt when he fell. I believe he was hurt because he is blank and he has a large blank on his arm. So you can just fill in these words wherever you think they go. You decide. These are not correct. I'm just randomly putting them in. I'm just showing you how it works. And then you can check your answer. And if you don't do so well like me, I didn't do so well, you can retry it. And that's the end. Okay, good job.